Hello, my friends. Today I want to talk about why accents are bad in fantasy. So please join me in the very German activity of drinking a beer. Zum Wohle, as my people say, which means cheers. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books and book-adjacent things. And today I want to talk about one aspect of epic fantasy in particular. It obviously comes up in other parts of the world of genre fiction, but I'll focus mostly on epic fantasy, and that is having characters that speak in accents that are actually written out, and why that may actually be a bit of a problem. So what we'll do is talk a bit about the problem in general, and then look at several cases all through the history. We'll look a bit at Tolkien, we'll look a bit at Robert E. Howard, and H.P. Lovecraft. We'll look at Tad Williams, because I'm currently reading him. And then we'll talk a bit about audiobooks that do, in fact, exacerbate the problem. So let's get started with one important thing here. Unless I mention it very explicitly, I am not calling out any author for being racist, classist, or anything of the sorts. I think a lot of the times this just happens on a subconscious level, and what I want to do with this today is, prod us all to sometimes pay attention and look at what certain things actually do when we read them with our subconsciousness and with our subconscious, and that's kind of the point here. So let's start with J.R.R. Tolkien, and start with one specific thing here. And that is the question, who gets to talk? Because when we read The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, it turns out that not everyone actually even gets to speak in language, right? Not everyone gets dialogue. And while this may be interesting, and even foxes get to speak in Lord of the Rings, I feel it's interesting that none of the the humans that are in fact under the spell of Sauron, the ones that come from the east or are dark-skinned, and where you can apply a lot of find a lot of racism with Tolkien, none of them actually get any lines of dialogue anywhere within Tolkien. And that's the first part where I wanted to talk about what we can take from a text when we look at who gets to say anything and who gets to say what in what kind of language. I'm not going to belabor it. It's just an interesting fact that when you read Lord of the Rings, the bad guys rarely get any lines of text whatsoever. We only see them from the outside, because they are, in fact, the other. They're also, clearly morally evil most of the time. Yes, there are obviously facts with, them being under the spell of Sauron and noble at heart, at least some of them, and so forth. I'm not going to go into that today, because that's not exactly, this is not going to be a Tolkien lore video. The next part, however, is interesting, and that is we get a few folks that are clearly the bad guys that do get lines of dialogue, and there we can discover something very interesting. See, when we look at The Hobbit, there's two bad people, so to speak, that get to say something. Well, three technically. These are the trolls, these are the goblins, and of course there's Smaug. Now Smaug is fairly easy. He speaks in a normal English and so forth, because he's obviously he's royalty, so to speak. And that's kind of the point there. With the goblins, it's very limited. They get to sing a really cool song, and beyond that they have only a few lines of dialogue. Smeagol is, of course, Smeagol. We'll not talk about Gollum here today, but the ones I want to point to mostly are the trolls, who are, of course, one large chapter of their own. I think it's chapter 3 in The Hobbit. And when we look at the way the trolls speak, we notice something, because they don't speak accentless British English. They, in fact, use what you might call slang and dialect. The trolls, in fact, say blimey, for example. They are, in fact, speaking in what you might call a working class to lower class, possibly Cockney accent. And I think that's an important point here. And then we'll go back to, move forward to the Two Towers, where we get a bunch of orcs speaking together. There's also two orcs talking, there's a bunch of orcs talking in the Return of the King as well, but mostly I want to focus on the conversations between Gorbak and, is it Grishnak? No, Grishnak is the one in the Two Towers, Shagrat. And of course, Ugluk and Grishnak in the Two Towers. Because once again, they oftentimes use words and diction and slang that is very much coded to like lower class and working class English accents. And I think that's an important aspect here. Because while the racist elements in Tolkien are not necessarily coded in language, but in other things, the classist elements of Tolkien's worldview are very much coded in language here. And I think it's important to understand that for someone reading these texts in the 50s, 40s, when those respective books were published, they would immediately associate those kind of accents with, well, working class and lower class people. In a society, the English one at that time, mostly the British one, that was much more stratified and hierarchical than it even is today, and it's still one of the more divided societies in the West, I would say. And Tolkien does, possibly subconsciously or consciously, chooses to actually code the bad guys, the orcs and the trolls, as, well, lower class and working class, with the way they talk, with our world, working class and lower class. Obviously, the trolls and orcs are also not exactly coded as very intelligent, so he does, in fact, apply stereotypes that upper class folks would apply to lower class humans in their society. He takes those stereotypes, those negative stereotypes, and uses them to characterize his bad guys in his world. And, I don't think that's a good idea. But I think there's something more here. Because with Tolkien, him being, a philologist and very much into language in general, we know that language is very much tied to character for Tolkien. See, when we have the scene in the Two Towers, when Aragorn and gang come to Edoras, Aragorn talks about the language of the Rohirrim being like their character and their country, wide and flowing and honest and so forth. And those are ideas that go back to German romantic notions of, language being tied into a national character that ultimately go back to Herder. And he does apply those in his fantasy world, because we know from other essays that Tolkien was very much, at least, an admirer of Herder, if not, actually applying him for his, his theories to Tolkien's academic work. So when Tolkien makes these choices and gives his bad guys the speech patterns, the accent of his own England's working class and lower class, he does very much move that those stereotypes go into both directions, and he does imply that his own lower class and working class folks are maybe also part of the dark side. Obviously, they work in industrial jobs, and we know how Tolkien feels about industrial jobs, don't we? So there is clear classism reflected in the way these characters speak in Tolkien's works. And once again, I don't know if Tolkien did this on purpose, but it's not good, is my point here. But obviously, classism is not the only thing you can find or read out of the way characters speak when they use accents. Which brings us to the wonderful field of full-on racism. And for that, I want to look at two pulp writers, those being Robert E. Howard, the writer of, among other things, the Conan stories and the Solomon Kane stories, and a lot of other stories. I personally really appreciate what Robert E. Howard did. I enjoy a lot of his stories, but there are certainly elements of racism. They are most pronounced in the Solomon Kane stories. They obviously also sometimes show up in the Conan stories and so forth. And in the Solomon Kane stories, when Solomon Kane, the British Puritan that has like very little to do with actual Puritan theology, wanders around Africa, freeing white women from black cannibals and so forth, as I said, the racism is insane there. But he does also have a African friend and ally. Nalonga is his name, and when he speaks in the absolute worst caricature of a, well, African exotic racist accent you can imagine. And I think it's sort of, not that necessarily Robert E. Howard really hated black folks. I don't think that's the case, but I think he thought that characterizing his character of Nalonga by giving him a very specific pidgin English with all the racist aspects that come with that was a good way, good shorthand to give that character a description, and that allows it for his readers to picture that character. So we can see Robert E. Howard's racism break free in all its glory in the way some of his black characters talk. Some of the Conan characters, when he encounters folks from Kush or somewhere in the Black Kingdoms, as they are called there, also speak in those ways. And once again, there's some brutal racism there. In, you know, if you read something like Shadows in Zembaula, for example, there's also some highly racist accents in those stories. It's even worse with his with Robert E. Howard's pen pal H.P. Lovecraft. We're not going into a full H.P. Lovecraft discussion, but suffice it to say, the man was an absolute monster of a racist, far beyond the level of racism common in his time. And there are certainly situations when, as tends to happen in Lovecraft stories, the bad guys are people of color. Either, well, just African American, or just what he calls black, or even worse for Howard, who's a bit of a eugenicist, they are somehow, well, what he calls mixed race. Well, he actually uses far worse slurs there, and I'd just not go down that road. And when you read something like The Call of Cthulhu, it is made very explicit that the way they mangle the language, the beautiful English language with all their, is tied to their utter evil, which is tied to their non-whiteness and tied to their non-pure, eugenically pure heritage and so forth. It's very explicit in the part of, say, The Call of Cthulhu, when they interview a certain former sailor who takes part in the Cthulhu worship in, I think it's New Orleans or somewhere in that area. It's one part of The Call of Cthulhu, which is definitely one of the more racist, even among the Lovecraft stories, more racist stories. And once again, that does come across in the dialogue that Lovecraft writes, because the way these characters talk is, once again, an ugly stereotype of people not understanding or not being able to speak proper English. And that is used to, you know, communicate their, well, their evil, I guess, in a lot of ways, and them not being good or not being human. It's used to dehumanize these people, which is something that Lovecraft is really good at dehumanizing non-white folks, is my point here. So we have very explicit racism with Lovecraft and Howard coming through in the way they write evil characters. But there's other ways of, you know, using racist stereotypes, problematic stereotypes, in the way fantasy writers write dialogue and write accents. Which brings us to Tad Williams, whom I'm currently rereading, and while I was aware of the fact, or in my memory was aware of the fact that there's some uncomfortable depiction of especially the troll culture in the work of Tad Williams, at least in the first trilogy, I wasn't prepared or didn't remember how bad it actually is. See, in the Dragonbone Chair, our hero, main character, Simon Mooncalf, meets Binabik, the troll. And Binabik is very much coded like, coded in the ways of a Native American, possibly a more northern tribe, the way fantasy words are used, the troll language words are used, and so forth. But he also constantly speaks in broken English. It's almost Yoda levels of comically broken English accent. And the question is like, why do you do that over a long time? Is it for comic relief? Look how funny it is to actually twist the language there. Or is there something more sinister going on there? Because you could just like say he had a strange accent and then just write out sentences in full normal English and the whole thing should work for a perceptive audience. But Tad Williams did not choose to do that. Instead, he continues to use, these awkward ways of building sentences and so forth. And one question that there might be, probably it's sometimes played a bit for laughs. Binabik, while being supposedly wise in the ways of his people, we'll go to that in a moment, is also a very positive character. He does provide a bit of comic relief, him and his wolf Kantaka. So there is that. And that is another way that language, or the lack of use of language, or language skill, has often been used to marginalize people. It's to belittle them, to make fun of them, and laugh at them, and that's something that we tend to do as humans. A lot of times, we meet someone, and they don't speak our language fully, they make a mistake, and it's easy to laugh about that, but it's obviously, if you continue to do that, it does very much hurt the people trying to speak a language that is not their native language, their first language. And it pushes them aside, lets them feel less than fully equal to, native speakers at the end of the day. And I think that's something I don't think Tad Williams did that on purpose. That's not how that goes. I think it's very much a sign of the times. These books were written in the 80s, and the 80s were a time when everyone thought that racism had been defeated with the civil rights movement, and making a few jokes about people having funny accents or having funny cultural traits is totally fine, because right now we're all on coke and the economy is booming, sort of. There's levels of cultural and racial insensitivity that are just part of that time, and I'll be very much interested to see how this has possibly changed or not changed in Tad Williams' recent trilogy in 4 books, the last one coming out next week. Or somewhere next week, I think. So I'll be looking forward to find out if Williams has changed, because belittling people of a different culture is something that happens oftentimes without actual evil intent, but it still does have that damaging effect. And the fact that, the trolls are actually more like halflings and half-sized does add to that whole idea of them being sort of less serious than Simon and the very good English folks of his culture. So we have the idea of making fun of an accent with Williams, which I assume right now is more on a subconscious level, or like a lack of awareness that this could be hurtful, especially in combination with the way their culture, the troll culture, is Native American coded. There's a second layer to that, of course, which is the sayings. Because there's a lot of places where the trolls have troll sayings and troll wisdom. And that's another thing that we find oftentimes in fantasy, when we code characters in a more like native or in some form or other less urban agrarian civilization or culture, but more in a tribal culture. We assume they have ways of talking that are in strange metaphors, and they have all these sayings of wisdom, and the troll sayings that are constantly quoted are part of that. That's a way of it's a positive stereotype in a way, but it's still a stereotype that leads to all kind of damage later on. The idea of them having this weird, mystic, native knowledge that is tied to the land in a way that is, impossible for us white folks to understand. And you're still creating a character there, a caricature of a culture there. And I think we can see the same going on there with, as I said, the trolls with Tad Williams. And once again, I assume it's mostly just the way people were talking about native cultures in the 80s and still are in the 90s and partly in the 2000s. Another group that where we can see that is, for example, in The Wheel of Time, where Robert Jordan makes the Aiel speak a lot of these similar, weird sayings that our nations, our folks have. My people say this, and it means this and this. And it's like, these are still stereotypes, because at the end of the day, what you communicate is that there is an experience that is a mystical experience that is unattainable for anyone else. And you still set them apart. It's still a tool for othering, and possibly making them less, or marginalizing them, because at the end of the day, they have a saying, and then they explain it to our white, mostly English-coded character, and then they understand what that wise saying means, but they now use that wise saying because the noble savage has attained that wisdom through their noble savagery, I assume. So we have both in the way the characters of the trolls speak in Tad Williams' Memory, Sorrow, Thorn trilogy, and we find the same in Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time. We find it obviously also in parts with the Fremen in Dune, and in all kinds of other epic fantasy stories. Don't get me wrong, this is not just these authors that I've picked out here today. Before we come to the final stages of this, I want to point out another author, in case, you'll accuse me of just picking authors I don't like. Let's talk about Terry Pratchett. Because Terry Pratchett does also use, accents a lot. He does use a lot of dialect. His direct lines of direct speech are usually written in non-standard English for every character. And there you can probably see the way this can actually go from okay to bad. And I think the worst part of it is in the book Interesting Times, which is set in Discworld's equivalent of generic Asia, probably mostly China, although there's obviously also some elements of Japan in there, but mostly China. And the dial, and we'll come back to that in a moment. And there, the patterns of speech and the way the accents are written is they're racist stereotypes, and they're explicitly used to make fun. Now, the point is, of course, that Pratchett makes fun of just about everyone, but because Pratchett is, at the end of the day, was a British author, a white British author, when he makes fun of his own folks and other, white-coded characters in a lot of ways, yeah, you're making fun of different accents there. And Pratchett is usually very good at making it clear that, accents are just accents. They're not tied to any character flaws or more other, moral judgments in any way. In fact, he does so in near the end of Jingo, where he makes it very clear that if the people of Clatch, who are sort of the Middle Eastern version of Discworld, are at the end of the day just as clever and just as human and so forth as the people of Ankh-Morpork, which is, basically White Britain, so to speak. He does make this very clear. So the accent, while being somewhat funny from time to time, does not necessarily, or is either so far over the top that it's very clear that he's making fun of how white folks think about stereotypical accents. In fact, he does actually make jokes about that in Jingo, but he kind of falls flat in Interesting Times. And that, I think, shows that the tool of satire, which is very much what Pratchett usually wields, can twist. It's a fine knife, and it can twist in your hand if you're not careful, and if you're not, very, very careful when you're approaching themes like race and culture in a lot of ways. So we see it there as well. Which brings me to the problem with audiobooks. Because audiobooks make this far worse. And let's stay with the Discworld audiobooks. Now, I'm a huge fan of the old Discworld audiobooks narrated by Nigel Planer. They're brilliant. Obviously, the audio quality is not as good because they're old, but usually I really appreciate Nigel Planer's narration. However, he does lean into these accents, of course, and in Interesting Times, the way he leans into the stereotypical Asian accents, yeah, that crosses the border to just full-on racism in a lot of ways, and it's bad. And I think that's a huge danger with audiobooks in general, because all of these, the way Andrew Wincock, the narrator for the Dragonbone chair does narrate Binabic's voice, is also leaning in heavily into these stereotypes. And that's a danger with, dramatic readings of audiobooks in general, that people sometimes fall into the trap of making funny noises, and funny noises are not funny if suddenly you're making racist stereotypical accents. And obviously your mileage may vary there from time to time, but I think it's important to understand this. When we write text, we obviously collapse reality into something very simple, that is language. When we take this language and add our weird way of writing a dialect, we already form the reader's expectation and imagination. But when an audiobook narrator goes with that and runs with it, there's a danger of taking something that was already borderline racist and turning it full-on racist in that situation, because they perform it in possibly a problematic way. And that can seriously hinder enjoyment of a text. I would not blame anyone for really being turned off by the performance of the Agathian characters in Interesting Times by Nigel Planer, because it's awful, or by the performance of Binabic's voice in The Dragonbone Chair, or any other of the ones that I've just mentioned here. I think it's important to understand that audiobooks, because they are performance, they tend to exaggerate things within the writing, something that can be overlooked by reading not too closely, or, using our own voices in our own head when we read a text. When someone else does that for us, we're stuck with their interpretation, and that interpretation might just be really awful. And that kind of brings me to the end of this conversation. See, epic fantasy is a serious genre. It's important to understand this. Usually, epic fantasy takes itself very seriously. We take world building very seriously. We take the stories very seriously. We call it epic. We talk about mythology and all of these things. We take this very seriously. Unfortunately, it's still writing and it's still fantasy, so we need to make these fantasy worlds come alive. And for that, it's very easy to, look for analogs in our own world and take bits and pieces from our own world and just kind of reskin them and put them into a fantasy world. And that's good practice, because, in a lot of ways that makes it easier for readers to connect to what is, in fact, someone else's invention and fantasy. So this does make sense. The problem is, once we flatten, the infinite dimensions of our world, we do tend to turn towards stereotypes. And a lot of stereotypes do have harmful sides to them. And sometimes, usually these stereotypes do perpetuate judgments that are connected with these stereotypes. We might not be aware of that, or the negative sides of that, because of who we are when we write something, or, read something. But it pays to actually think about what is done here, and why what are the other stereotypes and ideas connected to one accent? Like, what do we think when we hear a lower class, working class accent? What kind of other judgments are connected to that? Do we think these people will probably be very intelligent, but unfortunately pushed down by the system of capitalism that we're all trapped in? And if they could only have, the chance and a good education, they could actually blossom and be great people? Do we think that? Or do we think they're probably also alcoholics, have drug problems, and tend to be violent and less intelligent and so forth? Which are the associations connected with that? The same goes with racist stereotype accents. If these characters speak like a cheap racist stereotype of a generically Asian person, what kind of associations are coming with this, even subconsciously, before we start to reflect and think? Or with someone who's coded weirdly Native American. What are the associations that come with that before we even start to think? And I think that's, at the end of the day, where the problem with accents in a lot of speech lies, because they are direct speech, and we're paying attention to something else. We're paying attention to what these people are saying and not how they are saying it. That all these other ideas tend to just slip in and reinforce our own beliefs, probably erroneous beliefs and wrong beliefs about different people from different cultures and different classes. Once again, these are classes and cultures from our world whose speech patterns and so forth are taken and applied to a fantasy world where, depending on what kind of book you're reading, the cultures they are applied to there do have very direct moral judgments attached to them. Orcs are evil in Middle-earth, and suddenly they all talk like factory workers. What does that do with our imagination? What does that do with our judgments when we next, hear someone speak like the orcs from Lord of the Rings? Or, I think it's important to be aware of that, because it does not only matter what we say, it also matters how we say it. And when we write a book, or when we read a book, we're listening to multiples of voices from different places. So we need to be very, very aware of what's going on there. Anyway, these are my thoughts on accents. Once again, I don't think, except for H.P. Lovecraft and partly Robert E. Howard, anyone was doing this on purpose and trying to be a racist asshole. But it's still important to see how these things slip in all the way up to now. This is why I picked stuff from at least up to the 90s, possibly the 2000s. And I'll be looking at Tad Williams' new trilogy to see if he has shifted that. Otherwise, I don't know. Be careful what you read, pay attention to what is said and how it's said, and make your own judgments beyond that. And don't be afraid to call an author out if they do something stupid there. That's it for today. I hope you had a good time. I hope you learned something. I hope it made you think. Let me know what you think down in the comments. And I don't know. I'll be back with something else very soon. Until then, I don't know. Like, subscribe, do the things. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, thanks and cheers.